saw him as a gangster, no.
You saw him as?
I saw him as someone who inherited this thing. You start to find it's dubious because you don't know whether somebody wants you because they see you in
Al
the part.
Pacino is one of the greatest actors who ever lived. His performances in films like The Godfather, Scarface, and Serpico changed what people thought acting could be. But behind all that greatness, there were some serious clashes with fellow actors, not because of ego or money, but because of something far more interesting. It was about how you approach the craft of acting itself. Some actors over-prepare, some go method, some improvise, and Pacino had very specific ideas about what real acting looks like. When those ideas collided with someone else's, things got cold, fast. In this video, we're going to walk through 7 actors that Al Pacino allegedly had serious friction with. Some of these stories come from directors and crew members, some come from Pacino himself, and some are written right there in the silence between two people who never worked together again. Before we get into it, if you enjoy deep dives into Hollywood's hidden history, the real stories behind the iconic films and the legends who made them, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. We cover stories like this all the time, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's get into it. The first name on the list is Marlon Brando, and honestly, it might be the most famous clash in Hollywood history, even if neither man ever admitted it out loud. When The Godfather was being made in the early 1970s, two very different worlds were colliding on the same set. Marlon Brando was already a legend. He had defined what it meant to act in America. He was unpredictable, magnetic, and completely impossible to control. Al Pacino, on the other hand, was young, hungry, and incredibly disciplined. He had trained hard and thought carefully about every choice he made on screen. He wanted to feel the scene before it happened, not be surprised midway through it. The problem was that Brando operated completely differently. He would improvise, he would shift scenes without warning, he would change things up in ways nobody expected, including his scene partners. For Pacino, that kind of unpredictability was not exciting. It felt like working without a net, and not in a good way. He later admitted that Brando would just do things on set without telling anyone. You either reacted or you fell behind. But the real breaking point didn't happen on set. It happened at the 1973 Academy Awards. When the nominations came out, Brando was listed as Best Leading Actor. Pacino was listed as Best Supporting Actor. That might not sound like a big deal, but when you look at the film itself, Pacino was in nearly every major scene. The whole story is about his character's transformation. He carries the emotional weight of the entire movie. Being put in the supporting category felt like an insult, like the industry had decided that the film was really about Brando, and Pacino was just along for the ride. Pacino didn't go to the ceremony. He later tried to say it wasn't because of the nomination situation, but people close to the production told a different story. They said he was furious, not at the Academy exactly, but at the way Brando's name and legacy seemed to overshadow everything, even when Pacino had done so much of the heavy lifting. Brando, to his credit, never seemed to notice or care. He sent a Native American activist to decline his Oscar that night in protest of Hollywood's treatment of indigenous people, which completely dominated the conversation. Whatever tension existed between them was drowned out entirely. The two men never truly worked together again. In The Godfather Part 3, Brando appeared only through old archive footage. In real life, there were no joint interviews, no reunion photos, no warm public moments. People who knew both of them described the dynamic as a clash of temperatures more than a screaming fight. Brando was chaos, Pacino was control, and those two things just never found a way to coexist comfortably. Pacino did say at one point that Brando was like a magician. You never knew where the trick came from, but it always worked. So the admiration was real, but so was the distance. The second name is Leonardo DiCaprio, and this one is a little more surprising because DiCaprio genuinely idolized Pacino growing up. When they were both involved in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, directed by Quentin Tarantino, they didn't actually share scenes, but they were on the same set, and that was enough for their very different working styles to create real tension. DiCaprio showed up with annotated scripts, historical consultants, and deep research into the political and cultural world of late 1960s Hollywood. He had hired people to brief him on historical events from that era. He wanted to understand everything before he walked in front of the camera. Pacino watched all of this and was not impressed. In fact, it bothered him. From Pacino's point of view, all that preparation gets in the way of the spontaneous truth that makes a performance genuinely alive. He believed acting was something you feel in the moment, not something you engineer through preparation. During a table read, DiCaprio launched into a detailed analysis of Hollywood's power structure in the late 1960s. It went on for a while. Pacino apparently leaned back, exhaled slowly, and said something along the lines of, "The research department is down the hall. We're in the acting department here." It got a laugh, but it also made the atmosphere uncomfortable. For DiCaprio, this was devastating on a personal level. He had studied Pacino's performances obsessively. He had looked up to him for years, and now here was the man he admired treating his preparation like a waste of time. DiCaprio confided to people close to him that he felt crushed by it. He even questioned whether he was over-preparing, whether his thoroughness was killing the spontaneous magic that great acting required. Pacino had actually made the same criticism years earlier with Tom Cruise on the set of Collateral, telling him something similar, that you have to eventually stop preparing and just let something raw happen. The good news is that this particular story has something of a softer ending. In late 2024, Pacino and DiCaprio were spotted together at a private venue in Los Angeles. They were laughing, sharing stories, and by the end of the night, DiCaprio was helping Pacino to his car, calling him something affectionate. Pacino told him he had turned out all right. It wasn't a formal reconciliation, but it was a moment of warmth. The philosophical differences probably still exist, but the personal coldness seems to have thawed. The third name is Kevin Spacey, and this story is closely tied to the Collateral situation we just mentioned. Michael Mann's thriller Collateral, released in 2004, was supposed to feature both Pacino and Cruise. Cruise, as is well documented, throws himself into preparation with extraordinary intensity. He trains physically, researches extensively, and wants to understand every layer of a character before showing up to work. Pacino found this approach frustrating almost immediately. During early rehearsals, Cruise went into a detailed breakdown of his character's psychology and history. Pacino cut him off and said he didn't need to know where the character went to elementary school. He needed to know what the character was feeling right now, in this moment, in this scene. What followed was less a fight and more a standoff. Pacino tried to shake things loose by abandoning the script in rehearsals. Cruise stayed close to the beats he had prepared. Between takes, Pacino told him that at some point you have to set fire to the library and see what happens. The crew remembered that line. It captured the whole conflict perfectly. In the end, Michael Mann reworked the casting. Cruise became the assassin character, and Jamie Foxx took on the role of the cab driver. Foxx ended up getting an Oscar nomination. Pacino walked away from the project altogether. Years later, Pacino made a comment at the Venice Film Festival about preferring actors who live inside a house rather than just designing it very carefully. There was no need to name names. Everyone understood what he meant. There was no public explosion between him and Cruise, but there was also no reunion, just silence and separate paths. The fourth name is Kevin Spacey, and this one takes place on one of the most celebrated films of the early 1990s. Glengarry Ross was released in 1992 and featured one of the most impressive casts ever assembled for a drama. Spacey played John Williamson, the cold and calculating office manager. Pacino played Ricky Roma, the volatile and passionate top salesman. On screen, they were riveting together. Off screen, the friction was constant. Spacey worked with precise calculation. He mapped out his pauses, measured his tone, rehearsed until everything was perfectly calibrated. Pacino found this approach bloodless. Director James Foley later said that Pacino felt Spacey's method drained the life out of a scene, that it was performance being constructed rather than truth being discovered. The breaking point came during the climactic confrontation scene. Spacey delivered a technically flawless take. Pacino, still running on emotion after the scene ended, pulled him aside within earshot of several crew members and said something that cut deep. The comment was essentially that Spacey wasn't actually acting, he was demonstrating what acting looked like. The silence that followed was described by people who were there as suffocating. Spacey looked like he had been slapped. Spacey never responded to this publicly, but people close to him said he was deeply stung by it, and that his contempt for Pacino's methods was no secret after that. On Pacino's side, he later made comments in interviews and at events that clearly referenced their dynamic, describing actors who perform versus actors who reveal, and noting that audiences can always tell the difference. They never worked together again. No collaborations, no public moments of reconciliation, just a cold, permanent break rooted in a deep disagreement about what acting fundamentally is. The fifth name is Dustin Hoffman, and in some ways this might be the most intellectually interesting clash of all, because both men were at the absolute peak of their powers at the same time. In 1974, director Sidney Lumet had assembled both Hoffman and Pacino for a film about the Attica prison riots. It was supposed to be a landmark production. Instead, it fell apart before filming even began. And the reason was that these two actors simply could not agree on how to approach the work. Hoffman arrived with folders of research, psychological profiles, and endless questions about motivation and character background. Pacino grew quieter and more frustrated until he finally snapped, describing their preparation as performing autopsies rather than bringing something to life. When Hoffman kept stopping an improvisation to analyze what they were doing instead of just doing it, Pacino threw up his hands and said something about needing to stop building the violin and just play the music. Lumet pulled the plug on the project. He later said the collaboration was simply doomed because of the philosophical gap between them. What made this particularly exhausting for Pacino was that critics kept comparing the two men throughout the entire decade of the 1970s. Every award season, every major role, every film, people were always asking which one was better, whose approach was right, who was the more serious artist. Pacino despised those comparisons. He wrote about it in his memoir, noting that something was always in the air pushing them against each other. Hoffman, privately, described Pacino's approach as reckless and too dependent on mood. One crew member recalled him saying that Pacino jumped into rivers without checking if there was water. Pacino never publicly attacked Hoffman, but the two men remained permanently on opposite tracks, respected, celebrated, and completely unable to connect. The fifth name is Jared Leto, and in this clash comes from one of the most recent films on this list. House of Gucci was released in 2021, directed by Ridley Scott. Leto played Paolo Gucci with full method commitment, prosthetics, a specific accent, an elaborate physical transformation, and an absolute refusal to break character at any point during the shoot. Pacino reportedly did not even recognize him when they first met on set and treated him as an unknown extra until someone clarified who he was. What started as confusion quickly became genuine annoyance. Watching Leto's elaborate rituals day after day, Pacino grew increasingly skeptical. During one scene, Leto refused to step out of character even after the camera stopped rolling. In front of the whole crew, Pacino turned to Ridley Scott and said something along the lines of, "Kindly tell the kid the scene is over, he can come back now." For Pacino, this wasn't method acting, it was performance art pretending to be craft. He believed that acting meant peeling away the artificial until something honest came through. Leto's endless layers of external transformation seemed to him like the opposite of that, manufacturing truth rather than discovering it. Leto, for his part, maintained publicly that they had a warm and generous working relationship, but insiders told a very different story. Pacino reportedly asked to limit the number of joint press appearances he did with Leto. At premieres, the two men barely interacted. The philosophical gap was simply too wide. What Leto saw as total devotion to the role, Pacino saw as unnecessary chaos that got in the way of honest scene work. The seventh and final name is Johnny Depp, And this one is particularly interesting because on screen in Donnie Brasco, the two men were absolutely magnetic together. The 1997 film tells the story of an FBI agent who infiltrates the mob and gets dangerously close to one of the men he is supposed to be investigating. Pacino played Lefty, the aging mobster with absolute emotional depth. Depp played Donnie, the undercover agent, building his character from the outside in. Quirks, accent, physical details, external behavior. Director Mike Newell later explained the fundamental problem clearly. Pacino needed everything to come from an emotional core. Depp worked from external details inward. Those two approaches create very different kinds of presence on screen, and when they had to connect emotionally in a scene, the gap became visible. During a key restaurant scene, Pacino reportedly stopped mid-take and asked Depp directly where he was because he clearly wasn't present in the scene with him. It was a pointed challenge, and the set went very quiet. The tension was serious enough that the producer had to step in multiple times throughout the shoot. Pacino later said, without naming Depp, that some actors create characters while others reveal themselves through characters, and that the problems start when those two types try to share the same space. Depp eventually addressed it publicly, describing Pacino as completely out of his mind on set, but clearly with affection rather than malice. Pacino shot back that Depp was pretty strange himself. It was one of the only moments of genuine warmth between them, bonded by their shared weirdness. Since then, they have not worked together again. No sequels, no reunion projects, just silence, which in Hollywood says more than most words. What connects all 7 of these stories is the same thread running through all of them. Pacino was not fighting with these actors over money or credit or billing. He was fighting about something he cared about far more deeply: what acting actually is and what it demands from you. To him, great performance is about raw honesty in a specific moment. It cannot be engineered, researched into existence, or manufactured through external transformation. It has to be felt, right now, with this person in this scene. Whether you agree with that philosophy or not, it produced some of the greatest performances in the history of cinema, and it also produced some of the most fascinating, quiet, and lasting conflicts the industry has ever seen.